Welcome back. You should by now have heard the two videos on the two authors, Petronius and Seneca. And now we're going to branch away from the specific works of those two authors to talk about the two genres of satire and novel. These are quite unusual genres for the ancient world because the one of novel represents a literary type that is not well represented generally in the ancient Greek and Roman worlds, that is prose fiction. And satire is an unusual type because it's one of the few that the Romans appear to have turned just about entirely on into their own original genre, even though there are clear precursors for it in early Greek literature with comedy and some forms of tragedy. So let's now turn to these two forms of literature. I'd like to first have you pause your video and go to Sakai under Resources. There are two documents, one about Xenophon and one about Horace. Please pull out those two documents, the one about Xenophon and the one about Horace. And you might also afterwards want to turn to your schedule for this week and get out the entry that will show the outline for Seneca and for satire and novel. So please pause your video, get out those two documents, and then move to your schedule for this week, the outline on satire and novel. Okay, are you all set? Awesome. So, as you've maybe have already seen, if you have read the works of Petronius and Seneca, we have literature that is essentially satiric in type. Obviously, the tenor of the two works is quite satirical because it's making fun of either personages like Trimalchio at the dinner or Encolpius and all these rather crazy gay types all trying to hold on to this young boy, or Emperor Claudius. In the case of Seneca, and in some cases it's making fun of institutions, like probably the whole institution of the Principate, or the whole notion of the freedman who is able to become this fabulously wealthy person, the idea of gaining freedom as an ex-slave, and what that can turn into if somebody becomes excessively wealthy too fast, and so forth. The whole patron-client relationship that a lot of people are dependent on at Trimalchio's dinner, and so forth. So it's obvious that there is satiric content in these works. However, it's important to distinguish the content in a loose sense from the actual genre of satire that we're now about to discuss. So make sure that you follow along with the outlines that you have, the works of literature, and generally come to understand that these two particular genres are not ones represented all that closely by the other works that you're reading in this course. Okay, so let's begin now with satire. So you now have in front of you the work of literature by Horace. Horace wrote two different groups of satires, one called sermones, or conversations, and the other called epistolae, or letters. These works were written contemporary with Virgil in the 1st century BC as Rome transitioned from the Republic to the Empire. Now, unlike Virgil, who wrote principally epic, Horace wrote poems in other types of meters, including short lyric meters, and then also the satiric epic meter, in which he could talk about a multitude of different subjects, as we'll discuss momentarily. So you can kind of get a sense from the document that you have open, Horace Satire 1-9, because this one shows you an example of the kind of informal, rather conversational kind of topic about this gentleman who insists on latching himself onto Horace because he's trying to get social mobility. So instead of talking about some grandiose topic like the foundation of Rome, the travels of Aeneas from Troy to Italy, and so forth, we're talking about a more personal, restricted scope, specialized topic. And satire, in fact, has the option to talk about whatever topic it wants to, and it's often of the personal choice of the author. So therefore, it's not at the behest of some higher leader like the emperor, and it's not required to be especially grandiose in its topics. Instead, again, it's much more personal and focused, almost like a blog type of article for what the author wants to discuss. Also, of course, the author has things to say that are rather critical of the Republic or Empire. Now, the author is free to write what he wants to, as long as he does not get too personal with specific personages. So if he does that, he is liable to run into trouble, as in the case of the earlier literary writer Naevius, who wrote comedies and tragedies. He also wrote a particular poem that was critical of the family of Metelli, one of the leading senatorial families, and as a consequence, Naevius ended up in prison. So although the satirist could speak and write fairly freely about his points of view about things, it stopped short of direct personal attacks. The satirist was free to write what he wanted to, so long as he did not go too far. And we don't know of any other situations with satirists in which they got themselves into trouble. Apparently, they knew how to toe the line and they did it correctly. But it meant that the satirist couldn't necessarily try to make specific direct points about what was going on in the Republic and the Empire, only his own personal opinion of it, and only in a generalized and therefore rather restricted way. All right, let's now get to the actual origin of satire itself. The Roman literary critic Quintilian, who was the tutor for several students during the period of Emperor Domitian, wrote that satire, at any rate, unlike other genres, is all our own. He credits the Romans entirely with having invented the genre of satire as if it never existed before. That's not exactly true, because if you look back at Greek lyric poetry, Greek tragedy, such as Euripides, and Greek comedy, most notably Aristophanes, you see quite a bit of satiric content in these works, and especially the way that satire can make a direct commentary on the political or social reality around the author. So it's definitely not the case that Romans completely invented the idea of poetry presenting invective against society around it. However, the particular genre of satire with epic meter, that indeed is an invention of the Romans. So in that sense, Quintilian was correct that the Romans figured out a way to present satiric content in a specific new way that eventually developed into the genre of satire. So it's kind of half right what Quintilian said. All right, so satire itself, the word, comes from the Latin word satira, which means saturated or full, and it can also get a sense of mixed, as in a particular dish served for dinner that was some type of a tossed salad in which there were a multitude of different elements put together. So a satire is essentially a medley of topics, and again, will typically be topics of the choosing of the author, personal for the author's interests. It is important, by the way, not to confuse the word satire with the word satyr, S-A-T-Y-R, which is the half-man, half-goat worshiper of Dionysus, like Grover in the Percy Jackson series. It's tempting to see connections between satire and the satyrs, because the satyrs certainly had a satiric aspect in the way that they worship Dionysus. But it turns out those two words do not, in fact, relate to each other etymologically, so therefore do not make that confusion. Instead, it is this word here, satira. The first writer of note of satires in the genre sense was Gaius Lucilius, who lived from 180 to 103 BC, therefore a century before Virgil and Horace. He was not actually the first writer of satires. That credit goes back to the earlier writer Quintus Ennius, who wrote from 239 down to his death, I should say lived from 239 down to 169 BC, so therefore wrote in the very late 200s down to into the 100s BC. Quintus Ennius wrote many different genres, such as historical poetry, satire, comedies, and tragedies. He was the first one to have given a whack at writing satire, but Gaius Lucilius was the one who in fact became the expert at satire, and therefore was called the father of satires. He is not his works, in fact, do not actually survive, but we have enough fragments to get a pretty good idea of how he went about it, and in particular how pointed and direct and blunt he could be with his attacks. It's under Lucilius that satire took on the convention of being written in epic meter, the same dactylic hexameter, bum 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 bum, used by Virgil and Ovid, Virgil and Aeneid, Ovid and Metamorphoses. The epic meter now serves the function of presenting satiric topics in a specific metrical form that ultimately becomes the genre of satire. And again, the topics can be of any type that one wants. Frequent topics that come up are individual personages, not necessarily people of note that might get the author in trouble, but like this gentleman in Horace's satire trying to get an introduction to Maecenas. We'll talk about that in just a minute. It can be about food and cooking, something that was rather dear to Horace's heart. Sometimes it's about people who are poor, who are trying to sucker up to patrons as their clients so that eventually they can get handouts and maybe ultimately get a mention in that particular patron's will one day. So basically legacy hunting and so forth. Those are all the kinds of things that can be mentioned in satire. Many, many, many more topics can be. Now, there is a form of satire referred to as Menippean satire that is going to also be relevant to novels. Menippean satire is named after a Greek author, Menippus, who is associated with a series of tales called Milesian tales. And Milesian tales were random stories that were told one inside the other as part of a larger network. And Milesian tales often had a satiric element of their own in the way they described human relations, sometimes a bit lubricious in the way that they describe human relations, and so forth. But Menippean satire also has a specific genre aspect to it. It is what we call prosometric. And prosometric means simply prose and meter put together in one piece of literature. So that's just quite unusual. There are no other forms of literature in which you get prose, that is non-poetry, and poetic metrical work put together in the same genre. So Menippean satire is a specialized form of satire with this characteristic. The first author who wrote it that we know of was the Roman 1st century BC author Varro, V-A-R-R-O, who wrote on many, many different topics and in many, many genres, a very, very large output. Unfortunately, most of his works have been lost, including the Menippean satires, but we know that he did give a crack at those, and it's his works that probably influenced the later two authors whose works you're reading this week, Seneca and Petronius, whose works are quite notable for their Menippean satire characteristic. Okay, so that's satire, the genre. And as in front of you, as I say, you should have a Horace's satire about the guy who is trying to get a social introduction. The reason why the guy is being so obnoxious in that 1.9 is that he is aware that Horace is connected with the emperor's patron of the art, Maecenas. This guy doesn't necessarily come off as a particularly poetic type, but he seems to be wanting to get introduced up into the higher circles. And so he refuses to leave Horace alone. But it turns out that he is a defendant in a law case. Although the Horace tries at one point to get rid of him that way, he still hangs on. And Horace's friend comes over, and Horace even tries to get the friend to take him away from the other guy, but the friend knows what Horace is trying, and to be mean about it, he says, no, we can't talk about our matter. It's Friday afternoon. The Jews are going to get upset. But finally, Horace is lucky, as he puts it, sic me servavit Apollo. Thus Apollo saved me. And that's because the plaintiff in that case tracks down that defendant and has him arrested and actually calls Horace as a witness. And Horace goes like this with his ear to say, yes, you can call me as a witness. And the guy is hauled off. So Horace is saved. So that's an example of a sort of annoying but rather semi-comic incident in Horace's life. And that's the kind of thing, the kind of story that one can get in satire. All right, let's go over to novel. And for novel, you want to now get out the Xenophon work, the one called Chiropaideia, or Education of Cyrus. Novel is basically prose fiction. It has certain characteristics of it in its proper form, which is that it's usually an extended adventure story, often involving a stupid young man in love and some kind of really beautiful woman who might be a prostitute or might be a woman who has been purchased by some higher up, like a major or somebody, or is for some other reason unavailable or inaccessible. Usually the man and the woman are deeply in love with each other, but circumstances, society won't let them get together. So then there's a point in which they do finally get together, and they may travel off on board a ship. If they travel on board a ship, it will always sink in a storm. And so forth. There's all sorts of adventures involving the man and the woman who are somehow trying to get connected and can't. So there are 5 surviving Greek novels from the later 200s to 100s BC. It's therefore important to note that this is quite a bit after classical Greek period, which is like 500s, 400s, 300s BC. This is during the Hellenistic period in Greek history, and in fact stretches down into the period when Greece is taken over by the Romans. So there are, as we said, there are 5 novels, including this one called Daphnis and Chloe. And again, these are all solid prose works. In Roman times, the genre of satire is represented by the 2 authors whose works you read, Seneca and Petronius. And your final work that I'm attaching on as an optional one for you is Apuleius, the work called De Metamorphoses. So Seneca, Apocalyptosis, as we'll talk about in a separate video, is the novel about the death of Claudius. Obviously, it is satiric. We're not meant to take anything literally about the death of Claudius or the subsequent accession by Nero or the whole court case that happens up on Mount Olympus about Claudius's deification that ultimately is rejected. None of that is obviously is literally true, and in fact, it's a very nice parody of a myth about Mount Olympus and Roman trials and so forth. But Seneca, nonetheless, has written a very nice novelistic piece in which he's really in brute force lambastes the deceased figure of Claudius. Seneca, you'll notice, does have some poems that show up in the middle. Probably the nicest one is the poem describing the lyre playing that Apollo plays when the Fates are trying to spin out the fate of the upcoming Emperor Nero. The way that Apollo is able to trick the Fates by charming them into spinning a much longer life than was really appropriate for Emperor Nero. It's hard to know whether Seneca did actually foresee in real life at this point when he wrote this work how monstrous Nero was going to be, and still more that Seneca himself would be forced to commit suicide after actually handing over a lot of his wealth after the Great Fire at Rome in AD 64. Hard to know whether Seneca sensed this or whether he was really caught off guard and would have gone back and recanted on everything he said in the Apocalyptosis. But anyway, this is an example of novel and also particularly a Menippean satire because it's got the poetry and prose put together. Petronius, the Satyricon, is another example of a satire, a novel, and specifically a Menippean satire because it too has the mixture of prose and poetry together. Later in the work, among the fragments, you can find the City of Rome hymn. And that piece of poetry is inserted into the larger narrative work. Apuleius' work, Metamorphoses or Golden Ass, is not actually prosometric, so it's not technically a Menippean satire in the formal sense, but it does have some aspects of the Menippean satire aspect in that it too, like the others, has smaller stories inserted into larger stories. So the bigger story is the misfortune of Lucius in getting turned into a donkey because of the potion that's mixed incorrectly. While he's wandering around as a donkey, he encounters other situations that engender their own stories that get narrated within the larger narrative of his adventures. And then along the way, Lucius overhears, in donkey form of course, the narrative of the myth of Cupid and Psyche. And that in fact is a relatively extended story that takes up quite a bit of space and time away from the main narrative of the donkey, Lucius. So that's an example of the Milesian tale aspect of stories being mixed in within stories. And so in that sense, it does somewhat correspond to the Menippean satire genre, even though it doesn't actually have the poetic element that we associate with that genre. And finally, I'll point out Xenophon's work on your handout. This is called Chiropaideia. It means the education of Cyrus. This refers to the boyhood of the eventual king of Persia, Cyrus the Great, the one who is best known for his defeat of the city Sardis in 546 BC, whereupon he would go on to overthrow both the Lydian and the Phrygian kingdoms and thereby bring Persia into its first close contact with the Greek world lying to its west. So Cyrus had a rather unusual background because he was in fact a bastard child. And at the beginning of Herodotus's history, Herodotus, the Greek historian from the 5th century BC, describing the origin of the Persian Wars between Persia and Greece, there is an oracle stating that a particular person will not lose power, that is Croesus, won't lose power unless a mule gets in charge of the Persian Empire. Of course, Croesus doesn't think that will happen, and so he figures nothing is to be worried about because, of course, mules can't possibly rule anything. They're animals. Well, no, not quite, because a mule can also be used as an informal term for somebody who is born illegitimately or out of proper wedlock. That in fact, is the case with Cyrus. So Cyrus is a good example of one of those hero types who comes into his very high status from very humble origins in which he's not raised properly by his own parents. Or there is something else rather unusual or, let's say, socially not entirely acceptable about his own upbringing. So Cyrus distinguishes himself as a very witty person. And so the concept of the education of Cyrus is meant to show how Cyrus, in this historical fiction context, ultimately exceeds to becoming the top ruler of Persia, and how, in fact, he gets up there in a really excellent way. This goes on for 8 books, and at the very end of the 8th book, after Cyrus's death, there's a very quick addendum stating that Cyrus's 2 sons after him essentially ruined Cyrus's efforts with the Persian Empire and allowed the empire to deteriorate into a much worse state than what Cyrus had been able to build up. We're not sure if that final chapter does actually correspond with the entire work. That it's possible that it might have been added on later and not originally written by Xenophon. But for you, what you should note in the introduction that's given to you in the handout is that, very similar to historic works, especially that of Livy, you'll notice how Xenophon goes to a great deal of effort to introduce Cyrus's background before getting into the proper narrative. And also Xenophon, as Livy does at the beginning of his work, introduces his own moral philosophy that's guiding him as he writes this work about the education of Cyrus. Xenophon himself, in many of his works, he too had multiple genres that he wrote in, has leadership as one of his main themes. Xenophon believed that proper leadership and the skill and as acting as leader was one of the most important qualities for a prominent Greek figure to have. And so he demonstrates how leadership comes into being in excellence with the figure of Cyrus growing up from boyhood and eventually being able to arrive at the position of king. And then, as we say at the very end of the work, Xenophon kind of tears it all to shreds by saying after Cyrus's death that the entire thing fell apart. All right, so I hope you enjoy the works of Petronius and Seneca, and I definitely hope that you understand better from this video there's the genres of satire and novel, and understand again how relatively unusual these genres were, despite the fair number of representatives these have. The Romans indeed took literature in 2 very different new directions with these 2 genres. And although we can't really believe that both of them are entirely to be credited but to the Romans, the way that Quintilian would have us believe, nonetheless, it is quite clear that the Romans did something quite unusual and distinctive with both of these genres, and we're fortunate to have, unfortunately, not Petronius, because it's fragmentary, but the entireties of both Seneca's novel and Apuleius' novel in our Roman mythological pantheon and corpus of works. All right then, enjoy these 2 works, and we got to move on now pretty soon to the final phase of Ovid's Metamorphoses, so that you can complete that work and complete the Ovid's point of view assignment that's coming up. And you'll be very glad to see finally that work wrapping up with the final events in human creation and evolution, culminating in the fall of Troy and eventually the foundation of Rome and its development into the empire. Okay, we'll see you next video.